Hi, and welcome to Life, Leadership and Change. I'm your host, Kara Hawkins. This show is built around three big topics: who we are, how we lead, and the world we're creating together. Each episode, I sit down with entrepreneurs, creatives, academics, and change makers from around the globe to share real stories and insights about inner growth, purposeful leadership, and shaping bigger systems for the better. Whether you're here for the big systemic questions, the deeply personal ones, or the parts in between, there's something here for you. Welcome back to our 4-part mini-series on complexity leadership. In episode 1, we unpacked what complexity is and what it really means for how we lead. In episode 2, we explored whether humans are actually equipped to deal with the level of complexity we're facing and what skills we need to lead in an increasingly complex world. And today in episode 3, we're exploring one of the most complex issues of our time. This issue underpins so many of the debates, tensions, and conflicts that we see socially, politically, from family units to organizations, and this issue is the topic of culture wars and colliding worldviews. Today, my guest and I explore the influence of competing worldviews on culture wars to understand the breadth and depth of its impact, but also to explore what we can do about it, as individuals and in our communities. It's a jam-packed session with plenty of tangible examples and ways you can apply some of these understandings in your own life. But as always, we'd love to hear from you. If anything we discussed today sparks a question, send it over for our bonus Q&A episode at the end of this mini-series. My guest across all 4 episodes is Dr. Aiden Thornton, a complexity leadership scholar, management consultant, and entrepreneur with over 25 years of international experience across Asia, Australia, and Europe. Aiden holds a PhD in complexity, leadership, and cognition, and is an adjunct associate professor of complexity leadership at Swinburne University of Technology. He runs his own consulting practice specializing in leadership development, change management, and organizational culture, has founded a psychometric startup focusing on modern leadership capabilities, and hosts his own podcast as well as writes on leadership, complexity, truth, and epistemology. Aiden also sits on the board of directors of the Association of Change Management Professionals in Australia and New Zealand and brings a rare combination of academic rigor, real-world experience, and, as you'll soon find out, a great sense of humor to everything he does. Enjoy! Welcome back, Aiden, for episode 3 of our mini-series where we're talking about the culture wars.
Thank you so much. Can't wait for the conversation ahead. I'm armed with my matcha latte that'll give me all of the brain power I need for today's conversation.
Good idea. I think I should have got one myself. No, one aspect of complexity, which is what we've been discussing to date, is observing increasingly polarized worldviews and what you call the culture wars, which we'll go into soon. So that will be the focus of today's discussion. And just before we dive in, a note to listeners that we will be discussing some controversial social and political topics. We're not necessarily articulating our personal or very specific worldviews, and we have to mention that they don't reflect the views of any employers. We're just more taking an academic perspective, discussing different dynamics and how we observe them today. So, Aiden, why is this in conversation around culture wars and polarized worldviews important in general, but also today and right now?
I think it's such an important question. My sense is that so many of us have just sensed a significant shift in society, particularly in Western democracies, right? Something's shifted. We don't seem to be so skillful at agreeing to disagree. I think there are certain types of social issues that have become a lot more salient, particularly issues related to personal identity and group membership and whatnot. I think many of us have observed a rise in political polarities, potentially also activism, for and against different issues and so forth. And I think the term culture wars has now become part of, public discourse to describe some of these things that we're observing. Some people find the term culture wars to be a bit adversarial. Some people find the cultural wars to be a term that is really just describing their actual experience, because it can really feel like that. And in my view, the culture wars may be caused by kind of complex dynamics occurring in society, but it's also an instance of where we need to apply complexity leadership to navigate our way through it. So I think there's different ways of thinking about the relationship between the culture wars and complexity leadership, in my view anyway.
Yeah, I like that distinction too, or the sort of coming at it from two angles, is that it's sort of born from complexity, but also requires complexity leadership to address. From my personal experience, or just anecdotally, I do feel like a lot of people are discussing that shift that
Oh,
everyone sort of has felt, but I don't know if anyone can really define what it is clearly. It's a feeling. And I think it would be interesting to go into sort of, I think everyone feels like there's something that's different or a bit unsettled, but it's not clear what it is or why.
so what you just said is actually really important because I think that comment's going to resonate with a lot of people. People can feel a shift, but they can't necessarily put their finger on it. They don't know where it's come from, what it is, but they kind of can feel these different manifestations of it in, daily life or work life or whatever. So I think that's actually a really important point. And so today for me is an exploration of some of those things to at least provide my perspective on why I think some of those things are happening. And then my colleagues and I are actually going to be running an event on the culture wars and colliding worldviews later this year. So I'll provide some details maybe later on in our conversation. Can I just ask you though?
Absolutely.
You also sense that people think that something shifted. How does it show up for you?
That's a really great question. In terms of my circles or me, my personally?
It's like, well, just conversations that you're part of. Like, how do you notice
Mm.
shift? Yeah.
Well, initially it seemed to be a carry on from the pandemic where everything felt a bit off. And that sort of people, I think, at least from my observations, were attributing it to the pandemic or post pandemic world. But because it's dragged on for quite some years now, I think people are starting to think, oh, okay, maybe it's not all associated with that. And, there are those elements in terms of just the world not feeling the way it did, probably also a different conceptualization of time. I think a lot of people feel like time has sort of compressed since the beginning of the pandemic, but also been stretched out in some strange ways. And I think other discussions is, really around politics and the changing world order and how quickly things are happening in that space from, I guess, the norms that a lot of us really grew up with or, knew for the majority of our lives, and seeing that change and maybe not feeling like there's that much control around it as well.
Yeah, okay. So for you, it's mostly emerged through COVID and post-COVID. Is that my understanding you correctly?
I think that's where I've noticed it become the strongest, or, beforehand I wasn't noticing as much. To be fair, also beforehand I was traveling around the world in, quite frequently and moving quite frequently. So I don't know if I was in one place long enough to really notice, but now being grounded in Australia, maybe I have noticed in a different way. But how about for yourself? What does that shift look like for you and your circles?
Well, you know, um, I've been interested in this topic for the best part of 15 to 20 years. And I don't think it's been as salient and as obvious as it is right now. But I think in some circles, in academia, for example, I think a shift has been quite apparent. I think that in some social circles, the shift has happened more quickly. My sense is that it's really kind of reached a peak point in Australia over the past couple of years, possibly to the present day, which is why I think a lot of people are talking about this. But I mean, so to answer your question, so how does it show up for me? I think over the past few years, there are a number of ways that the culture wars really shown up for me. So maybe I can just kind of trot through a few examples just to give you, just to kind of bring to life what I'm talking about when I use the term culture wars,
Mm.
particularly as it relates to identity and group membership. So for me, so example number one would be, gender related conversations. So some people are arguing that there are zero genders. Some people argue that there are two genders. Some people argue that there are multiple, if not infinite genders, for example. Example number two would be, pronoun related topics. So some people are arguing that the use of pronouns, should be mandatory in order to demonstrate respect to people, particularly gender diverse individuals. Other people argue that it should be optional because otherwise we're coercing people into compelled speech. A third example would be things like, sports type conversations. This has been had, at the scale of the Olympics, for example, around the inclusion of transgender women in women's sports to be inclusive, or other camps argue that yes, we should include transgender women in sports, but in another category, for example. A fourth example would be conversations around science and the scientific method. Some people are arguing that the scientific itself needs to be decolonized, whereas other camps argue that science was never colonized in the first place. And so it makes no sense to talk about decolonizing something that was never colonized in the first instance.
Could you give an example of what that might look like if people have never heard those two terms put together?
Well, I think that the camp that is arguing that science needs to be decolonized believe that science is a uniquely Western mode of thought, and it depends on using particular types of reasoning and particular types of evidence to justify particular types of conclusions. And I think these people would probably argue that, yes, science can be perfectly useful in some contexts, but it's not necessarily any more or any less legitimate than other ways of knowing
Mm.
lived experience or indigenous ways of knowing and what have you. And so I think the decolonization of science is kind of trying to extract the uniquely European and Western elements out of science so that it might be less culturally biased in their view.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
that's where they're coming from. I think I've done justice. But maybe just to provide you with a couple more examples. So
Yeah.
number 5 would be, a lot of controversy around diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI practices. So, for example, some camps argue that we should have quotas for hiring people on the basis of race and gender. Other camps will argue that no, in fact, that's actually explicitly racist and sexist because we're making HR decisions on the basis of race and gender. And example 6 is around climate related issues. So some camps will argue that climate change is an existential threat. Other camps might argue that yeah, sure, the climate is changing, but that doesn't mean it's changing at a rate that poses a threat to life on Earth, for example. Example 7 would be, different ways of constructing knowledge. We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. So, yeah, science might be perfectly useful, but there are lots of ways of constructing knowledge, things like lived experience and science and indigenous ways of knowing and cultural narratives and different cultural logics and what have you. And all of these ways of knowing need to be included to live in a truly inclusive society. Other people will argue that, yeah, okay, all of that long list of ways of knowing might be interesting cultural artifacts, but that doesn't mean that they're equally reliable in terms of ways of constructing knowledge about the world.
Mm.
And then my last example, which is probably a segue into, our final podcast, is around the pursuit of truth. So some people will argue that the pursuit of objective truth is yet another instance of systemic oppression. Other people will argue that truth is a necessary condition for navigating the world. So, these are just 8 examples that have been increasingly salient to me over the past few years. And I should just say here, I'm presenting some of these things as if they're perfectly binary, like it's, just polar opposites. Of course, that's not the case. There's lots of shades of grey in between these things as well. But just to kind of, give some flavour to the type of things I was talking about, I just wanted to sort of present some contrasting views. So there's some of the things that are on my radar. How about you? Have you heard some of those conversations being had? Are there other ones that are on your radar that I haven't talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, those ones are big ones, especially I think, as you said, in the last couple of years, but also beyond that. Decolonizing science is something that I've come across only in more recent years,
Sure.
and just decolonization of thought in general, which seems to like become a bit more mainstream, at least whatever I'm coming across in my reading. And there are some really interesting books on that as well. But other things for me are, as you mentioned before, it does feel like there's less of an ability to have conversations where people are disagreeing respectfully and to be able to actually hear another person's side rather than shouting them down, drowning them out. And that's something that I feel I've seen. You see it in politics, you see it at the highest levels of leadership, although not leadership that we defined yesterday, different definition of leadership.
Right.
And I think I've seen that at all levels, and I feel like that has really flowed through so that there's less scope from what I've observed to have a capacity to disagree, and people are taking quite hard stances and not really able to hear another person's perspective or even where it's coming from, because that's why I'm interested in unpacking is people might hold a worldview, but when you unpack where it's coming from, sometimes it's easy to see how they got there.
Yeah, I'm totally with you.
And political polarization is significant, and that's something that I think that there's data on, especially in the younger generations, women becoming increasingly progressive and
Yeah,
men becoming increasingly conservative. And what is the impact on society
yeah,
going down the road if that trend continues?
I'm with you. Totally with you.
And so, how does this relate to the pursuit of truth, as you mentioned, and how we understand and conceptualize this? We've talked about sort of a post-truth world, and Does that impact how we're able to even engage in conversations around this?
I think so. I mean, look, some philosophers and social commenters have also talked about the post-truth era and different definitions of post-truth. I think the Oxford Dictionary defines the post-truth era as relating to circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And I think some of us can resonate with that. Some of us can resonate with that, right? I mean, it can be hard to identify the distinctions between fact and fiction these days. Some people don't think there
Mm.
is a distinction between fact and fiction. Some people don't think the truth even matters. And so there are lots of different arguments on the table around how we can make sense of some of these things. In my view, I think I've been having conversations about these topics for quite a long time. And in my in my experience, I think it can sometimes be constructive to have the conversation in a particular sequence. The first step is kind of just surfacing the topic of the culture wars and some of the issues that we've just been through, and just acknowledging that they are salient topics. People have got diverse views. They can spark fireworks. People can feel very strongly about them. People can feel very emotional about it. It can give rise to political polarities. So I think that's kind of step one. Step two is, in my view, exploring some of the underlying worldviews that may be playing a role in causing the culture wars, and I'll tell you what I mean by world.
Mm.
And then, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's enough just to acknowledge the fact that there are different worldviews and people are going to get to fundamentally different conclusions about how the world is. For some people, they like to go an extra step to talk about truth, and that's step three, and that is to talk about the possibility that some perspectives may be more true than others, and some worldviews may be more likely to yield perspectives that are more true than others. That's not necessarily a conversation that everyone wants to have, which is why I like to start with worldviews and then test the waters of having a conversation about truth. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like how you've conceptualized those steps. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. As you said, testing the waters. But then I really like how it's layered. So we're looking at, okay, culture wars are what we're observing, but what's influencing the culture wars? Okay, we've got worldviews. So what is a worldview?
Well, again, there's many definitions. I mean, I tend to think of a worldview as a framework through which people construct their understanding of reality itself. So, what is my framework on the world, and therefore, how do I think that reality itself is structured and organized? And so at this point, we might be thinking, well, you started off talking about culture wars, you're now talking about worldviews. How are these two things related? And I certainly don't have, any scientific evidence to support this, but I'm speculating that different worldviews may be having a rather strong role in causing the culture wars. And I say that because I suspect that when people adopt different worldviews, they're reaching completely different conclusions about the same topics. And not only are they reaching completely different conclusions, but they're also justifying those conclusions using completely different methods. And so because people are coming from different worldviews, we ended up talking through each other rather than actually participating in a conversation. And yeah, so let me just stop here to check in with you. How does that land with you so far?
Yeah, I just want to pause on that. So can you just go back to when you were saying just before you're talking about how we can be talking through each other. Can you just reiterate why it is that we do that?
Well, I'm speculating here. I'm not sure if this
Mm,
is a fact. This is just me speculating. I think one reason is because if two different people are coming from two different worldviews, it's quite
mm,
possible that those two different people have gotten to totally different conclusions about the same topics.
mm,
And and they've gotten to those different conclusions by using completely different methods to justify those topics.
mm.
And so even though we're superficially, it sounds like we're kind of talking about the same thing, we have such different worldviews, we have such different mental models, in the privacy of our own minds, that we're talking through each other rather than participating in a discussion.
Are there any examples that you notice around you that help to illustrate that at the moment?
Well, here's one. So we talked a bit about gender. So I know this is a controversial topic, and I know people may feel strongly about this issue. But again, we're trying to have this conversation in a constructive way in order to surface some of these tensions and create space to engage with them in a constructive way. So let me give you an example about gender, right? So I personally know people that have made the following three arguments, right? So the first kind of group of people that I know would be more theological in their more theological religious in their worldview. And so from their perspective, they would say, well, my God created men and women, and the way I'm justifying that is by appealing to my holy book or appealing to a spiritual authority, and that's my source of truth on how many genders there are. And so their conclusion is there are two genders for theological reason, right? So that's kind of group number one. Group number two would be more science-oriented type people. And so again, I don't want to overgeneralize. Not all scientists have this view. The particular people that I'm referring to have said that, well, actually, ideas about gender have mostly come from philosophy, actually, mostly from postmodern philosophy, from the likes of Michel Foucault. They've come from the third wave feminists like Judith Butler. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting philosophical ideas about gender, but there's actually not necessarily a lot of empirical evidence to justify that there is any such thing as gender at all. And so their conclusion is they're not sure that there are any genders on the basis of empirical evidence, right? So that's kind of the second group of people. The third group of people are more the critical social justice, camp. And many of them would say, well, gender is just a social construct. Gender is all about my internal felt sense of masculinity and femininity and my external expression of masculinity and femininity and the different social roles that I take up in society. It's an arbitrary construct. And so there should be no limit to the number of genders that exist, and there should be no limit to the number of genders that I identify with. And so you can see it'd be pretty easy for different worldviews to get to completely different views based on looking at completely different types of evidence and reasoning to justify
Mm.
those views.
And so that goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is those different ways of knowing. So if I'm using one way of knowing, say it's empirical, and someone else is using an indigenous way of knowing, and someone else is using a theological way of knowing, we all have our worldview and our perspective on a topic, but we're not even speaking the same language
Right.
in terms of how we arrived there.
Yeah. And everyone's so
Mm,
perspective is right.
yeah, of
This is
course,
actually what's
yes.
causing the collision between the worldviews.
And so what are some of the worldviews that we could maybe observe in today's society?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there are many different ways of thinking about this. And so, I mean, I can introduce you to just one perspective on this. I mean, I tend to think that at the very, very least, there are at least 7 major worldviews that we're seeing, particularly in Western democracies right now. So the first is a more indigenous type worldview that's looking at, relation to country, connection to community, narrative-based story sharing, narrative-based, knowledge construction. The second type of worldview is a more theological worldview, relying on holy books and spiritual authority, connection to a personal deity, and those types of things. The third worldview is a more modern scientific worldview that came about from the Industrial Revolution, which is looking at the scientific method and empirical evidence and what have you. The fourth worldview is a more classical postmodern worldview, which typically thinks that that truth is inherently subjective, and that truth may vary between different people's perspectives, and truth may vary from one culture to another culture. So, for example, what's true for me may be false for you, or what's true for my culture may be different to your culture. And so there's this relativistic sense that we often see in classical postmodernism. Critical social justice worldview, which seems to be giving rise to some of the activism that we're seeing at the moment, seems to be focused on the goal of equity, so emancipating the oppressed and giving voice to the social groups that have historically been more marginalized in society. So we want to be more inclusive of let's not just focus on science, but let's also include lived experience and indigenous ways of knowing and science and all of these other things as well. The sixth worldview that I notice is a more spiritualist perspective. The spiritualist worldview is a worldview that thinks that the universe itself is conscious, and consciousness is the most fundamental building block of reality. And so essentially what we're engaging with is a conscious universe, and we're conscious entities interacting with a conscious universe from a more spiritualist perspective. And the seventh one is a more meta-modern perspectives. And there's different ways of thinking about meta-modernism. But I tend to think that meta-modernism can kind of include and work across a lot of these different kind of worldviews. And one thing I just want to be really clear about is I'm not presenting these worldviews as being homogeneous things. I am well aware that different indigenous nations probably have different worldviews. For example, different theologians will appeal to different holy books and will refer to different gods and deities. Different scientists may measure different things differently, may look at different constructs, may analyze things differently. So there's a lot of variety within each of these worldviews. So they're not homogeneous. But it strikes me that these 7 worldviews feel very present in social discourse at the moment and seem to be playing some role in the culture wars, in my view.
Yeah, I like how you've broken those down into 7 different worldviews, and I can see how they show up differently in society. The question that comes to mind is, and from your perspective, the way that our, say, Western democracies or even say modern Australian society has been constructed, would it be fair to say that maybe 1 to 3 worldviews was sort of what we were built upon and what shaped our society, and there might be more worldviews that are now either appearing or becoming more dominant, and there's almost like a power play between worldviews. The dominant one is no longer maybe, or is losing dominance a little bit, and so we're seeing like a power play between different worldviews.
But that's one possibility. Yeah, I mean, I think the postmodernists listening to us would love that way of thinking about things because they will often think about kind of power hierarchies and power plays between different narratives and what have you. And really, what's going on here is a power play between different worldviews. So I think that's one way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Hmm.
But my sense is different parts of society are more strongly influenced by different worldviews. I mean, for example,
Mm.
if you go into many universities in Western democracies, you will find that classical postmodernism and kind of relativistic ways of thinking about things and critical social justice worldviews are very dominant, particularly in social sciences, humanities, and the arts.
At risk of going down a bit of a tangent, do you think technology and people's exposure to more parts of the world, or perhaps more thinking, or maybe being trapped more in an echo chamber, do you feel like technology might have influenced the development of different people's worldviews and how they develop them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think technological systems, social systems, and epistemic systems are inherently interrelated. The technologies people are using as a means for production, social systems around how people organize themselves, how they structure society, how they create meaning, and what have you. And then epistemic systems, which is what I'm getting at around the worldviews, different belief systems, and how people interpret reality and construct their understanding of reality. I think they're also interdependent. So yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
I think that it's bidirectional, right? It's a process
mm.
and also co-creating these things. So yes, is the answer.
And so we started with culture wars, and then we're looking at what potentially drives culture wars, and we've been talking about how worldviews can influence that. Are there a few worldviews in particular that you feel like might be contributing more to culture wars or just being more present in current culture wars?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is not a fact. This is me. This is not a fact. This is less than a hypothesis. This is me speculating. So I think to some extent, all 7 of them are at play or at work. However, my hunch is that the 3 main worldviews that are at play in creating the culture wars may be the theological worldview, the modern scientific worldview, and a critical social justice worldview. And I think this is particularly salient in the US political landscape. And I think it's becoming increasingly salient in Australia as well. I mean, if let's just think about this together for a minute, right? So, I mean, if you were a theologian versus an empirical scientist versus a critical social justice activist or or a critical theorist, then you're prioritizing fundamentally different goals. You're using fundamentally different ways of constructing knowledge. You probably have completely different views with people from the other worldviews about a lot of those sociopolitical topics that I introduced earlier. And so, in some ways, to me, this really feels like a recipe for the culture wars, right? Because essentially what we have here are different epistemic systems that are colliding with each other, and they almost feel like they're incommensurate because they can't really understand each other's perspective. They can't understand why someone would get to a certain conclusion. They can't understand why someone would privilege certain types of evidence over others. And so for me, it seems like those 3 are most strongly at play. And the reason that I think this is so strongly related to complexity leadership, which again is the school of thought in the field of leadership that I'm most interested in, is essentially because we've got 3 really complex systems that are interacting with each other in vastly complex ways.
Mm,
So, in one of our earlier podcasts, I said to you that I think one of the prerequisites for doing complexity leadership is a sound grounding in epistemology and a mature conception of truth and worldviews actually as well. And I think in the absence of that, it's very difficult to do complexity leadership, possibly impossible to do complexity leadership, because I think in the absence of that stuff, it makes it very difficult to interact with the complexity that's actually occurring in the world. And so
mm.
one of the reasons that I'm appreciative for today's conversation is because it gives us an opportunity to kind of give some language to some of these epistemic complexities that we're experiencing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, I just want to sit with that for a moment because there is so much in that, especially when we're talking about complexity. Like, this is just going deeper into looking at those layers that lie underneath it and maybe driving it as well. And from what you were saying, at the risk of horrifically oversimplifying around worldviews, the fact that we don't have a shared goal or outcome sounds like part of the reason why we're going in so many different directions with our worldviews, as opposed to,
Absolutely.
in theory, if you had a shared goal, perhaps you could get there differently, but at least if we can agree on the goal, it won't matter as much.
Yeah, well, firstly, I don't think that's oversimplifying it. I mean, one of the things we know in systems theory, complexity theory, is that typically systems are goal-seeking entities. And I mean, so let's just brainstorm some stuff together, right? So even if we think about theological worldviews, modern scientific worldviews, and critical social justice worldviews, right? So this is how it seems to me. So the goal of a theological worldview would be, interaction with a deity, would be something along the lines of, transcending one's, human form and, living with some kind of God for eternity, would be personal communion with a deity, those types of things would often come up in the theological worldview. Again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but would often come up in a theological worldview. From a modern scientific perspective, really the goal is around the pursuit of objective truth about the universe. We want to know what's objectively true about the universe. We want to understand what happened at the Big Bang, what's happened since the Big Bang to now. Is climate change objectively true? We want to find out how to best describe, explain, and predict aspects of the universe that we live in, right? That's, I think, one of the primary goals of modern science. For critical social justice, the goal is completely different. It's really, in most contexts, it's centered around equity is the goal of critical social justice, which is how do we make sure that people are not being privileged on the basis of intersectional characteristics, but how are we creating space for everyone to participate in society? And if there have been groups that have been marginalized and oppressed historically, how are we now creating a bit more space for those people to give them a stronger voice in social discourse? So that's how it seems to me. But I don't know. What do you reckon?
Mm.
Is that consistent with your view, or would you see it differently?
No, that absolutely makes sense because I think when we can't agree on when we're getting what we're getting towards, it's very hard to, come to the same outcome, to cooperate, to collaborate. And it does make sense that every worldview does have quite a significantly different goal. But what I'm also interested in is practically applying this in terms of how we create more, say, harmony in the world, especially looking at possibly politics or geopolitics. I
Yeah.
mean, we can see what's happening right now in the Middle East.
Well,
It's really hard to see sort of tangible ways forward, especially when there are such divergent, such long held, and such deeply rooted worldviews, I would suggest maybe, that do not agree on the goal and that I would argue don't have much capacity to listen to the other side or desire to in every front.
yeah. I'm totally with you. I'm totally with you. So going back to my kind of, fairly simplistic three-step process, firstly, surfacing topics around the cultural wars, secondly, exploring diverse worldviews, and then thirdly, for some people, exploring topics around truth. This is why step for me, today's conversation is really about, step one and doing a little bit of step number two, right? But step
Hmm.
one around acknowledging the importance of this topic, I think, is actually incredibly significant. And the reason I say that is because even in the past, the mere fact that people have raised this topic, mentioned the fact that it's controversial, mentioned the fact that people have diverse views on these issues, asked clarifying questions on some of these topics, has caused a very strong reaction in some parties. Well, it's disrespectful. It's disrespectful to even ask how many genders there are. It's disrespectful to even talk about the possibility that transgender women shouldn't be included in women's sport. And I think that kind of reaction makes things quite hard, in my view, because I think that obstructs our ability to talk about something that's impacting so many of us, at least in my view. And so I think we need to acknowledge this is something that's going on. It's impacting a lot of us. It's impacting a lot of our work lives. It's impacting organizational policy. It's impacting political policy, And I think that there needs to be a more constructive way through this than what we've experienced
Hmm.
over the past few years. I mean, I know people who've literally been tearing their hair out over some of these issues because they're kind of embroiled in some of these topics, but they don't understand how they come about and why they've become so politically charged, why they've become so politically motivated. And this is why I think having a conversation around worldviews is at least it's one piece of the puzzle. It's not the only explanation, of course, but I think it's one piece of the puzzle in helping us to understand why this is happening, what's actually happening, and then potentially how we can navigate it in a more constructive way.
And I think, as you said, having that ability to identify it, to conceptualize it, to have language around it, I would also say maybe to have that awareness for example, myself. If I'm
Yeah.
having feeling politically charged or charged about someone's statement or reaction to something, okay, what is the worldview that I might be coming from? What is
Right.
the worldview that they might be coming from? And
Yeah.
then potentially being able to find a constructive way through that as
Right.
well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, you just reminded me of one other thing that I think is just important
Mm,
is I don't wanna talk about worldviews in a way that they're like a personality typology that,
mm,
individuals fit cleanly into one particular worldview. I mean, it's might be possible to straddle a couple of worldviews or combine a few or something like that. But I think at least having some language like this gives us a heuristic for talking about these kinds of things. And as I think we've now uncovered through the conversation, it seems to me, and it sounds like it might seem to you, that different worldviews often have such different goals in mind, then because they have such different goals in mind, then they will often arrive at completely different conclusions. And those completely different conclusions are justified by using completely different ways of constructing knowledge. And so if we just take those
mm,
three things into account, different goals, different conclusions, different justifications, that's pretty significant. That's really significant.
mm.
Who teaches that in an MBA program? Who teaches that in a leadership
Yeah,
development program? Who teaches that in, you know what I
absolutely.
mean? So these are the kind of complexities that I think leaders are actually confronted with.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree that it is significantly increasing at quite a pace, and we see that playing out even in domestically because I've observed a new perhaps buzzword or a very frequently used word is social cohesion in Australia. And I mean, understanding what that is, sort of maybe having a bit more definition around that would be beneficial, but it's something that is now a focus here because of such diverse worldviews in society that are really starting to cause some quite significant fissures here.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah.
So we can start to observe ourselves. We can try and understand where others are coming from. We can, be able to have the language around it, and this is just starting on an individual level, to then try and forge a bit more of a constructive dialogue. Is that what you would suggest for an individual level? And is that sort of a similar approach for sort of bringing this up to, say, organizational level or national level?
I don't think there's any easy answers to that question, but I think it's a very important question to ask. I've got some ideas.
Mm,
So let me just share a few of them. So I think the first idea is that I think we need to make a distinction between acknowledging diverse perspectives versus pursuing true perspectives. So actually, let me list them first, and then I'll unpack each one of them. So the first one is the distinction between diverse perspectives versus true perspectives. That's idea number one. Idea number two is that this is where I think our complexity leadership skills have got to play a critical role. And yesterday I went through some of the cognitive skills and adaptive skills and collaborative skills and all that kind of stuff. In addition to that, there will also be some interpersonal conversational skills, right? So how do we relate to people who have completely different worldviews? How do we facilitate constructive conversations with people who have a fundamentally different worldview? Street epistemology is one particular conversational approach that I often use, but it's not the only one out there. So the second one I think are the complexity leadership skills, and the third thing is creating space for people to come together to engage on these topics.
mm,
Earlier, my colleagues and I will be running a Culture Wars and Colliding Worldview event later this year. We're just kind of finalizing the detailed design and the timelines and what have you, so I can't reveal too much. But I will say that for anyone who's motivated to understand the culture wars and understand these diverse worldviews, for anyone who wants to build some more skill around talking about these topics and engaging with them constructively, this might be the right event for you. So we'll be releasing a whole bunch of information, in the near future. So please watch out on, social media, LinkedIn, X, what have you, if people are interested in coming along. So let's just unpack each of these things because you just asked a great question. So acknowledging diverse perspectives versus pursuing true perspectives is my first idea. I think this is important because there are some complexity leadership people out there who are advocating for a focus on seeking diverse perspectives. And I get that. I understand the rationale for that because, complex issues are complex. They're going to have multiple facets, multiple different perspectives, and we need to understand many of them. However, my concern about that is that it is very easy to come up with an extremely long list of diverse perspectives, all of which may be false accounts of the world. So I'll just give you a simple example for podcast today, and then we can go into more elaborate examples when we talk about in our fourth podcast about truth. But let me give you one example. So suppose you said to me, "Oh, Aiden, what's the shape of the Earth?" And I said, "Oh, well, there's diverse perspectives on that. It's round, it's flat, it's an octagon, it's a pentagram, it's an oblong, it's a this and a that, right?" Now, surely that would satisfy your interest in diverse perspectives. But unfortunately, most of those diverse perspectives have nothing in common with the world that we actually live in, right?
Mm.
So my view on this is it's absolutely essential to allow people to have diverse perspectives. It's absolutely essential to create space for people to express diverse perspectives, even perspectives you strongly disagree with, right? In order to be consistent with the principles of democracy. If we're consistent, if we're focused on living in a democratic society, we have to allow people to have diverse perspectives. However, my view, which other people may disagree with, but my view is that of that very long list of diverse perspectives, only some of them are likely to be true accounts of the world that we actually live in. And so I think we need to create a clear conceptual distinction between acknowledging diverse perspectives and pursuing true perspectives, and then what are the methods that help us to make that distinction. So I think that's my first idea. My second idea is some of the complexity leadership skills. So as I said, the complexity leadership skills are fairly they're the kinds of skills that allow leaders to interact with complex topics such as the culture wars. Street epistemology is one of my favorites. So street epistemology is a way of facilitating a conversation with individuals or groups, and we ask very open-ended questions, and we create a space for people to explore what they really believe on a topic, why they actually have those beliefs, whether they think their justifications for those beliefs are persuasive, and then what their underlying epistemologies are. And it doesn't work for everyone all the time, but when you have a really good street epistemology session, it can help to unpack some of the stuff that I was explaining earlier. For example, why people would get to vastly different conclusions about gender, for example, because we can create a space to explore what people believe on the topic, what their justifications are, why they're persuaded by those justifications, and then what their underlying worldviews are. And that can be an incredibly eye-opening experience for many people because we don't necessarily have such deep conversations to plumb the depths of our own beliefs on these kind of topics. But when we
Mm.
other people, then it can really help to highlight the diverse views that people actually have on some of these very politically charged topics. Yeah, so I'll just said a lot of stuff, so let me pause it, and I'd love to hear your
Yeah, well, thank you for explaining the street epistemology. And I would agree. I think there really aren't that many opportunities for us to, I think, one, sit down and understand each other's perspectives and really unpack them, but also I think to unpack our own, or, a lot of people don't really have that opportunity to really unpack it and see where it's coming from. And actually what comes to mind is a previous guest, Gemma Pitcher, has talked about values-based messaging and understanding value frameworks, and how I think extrapolating it here, it informs people's opinions and experiences of versions of truth. And sometimes they're not that set. And so sometimes unpacking them can potentially uncover possible contradictions that we weren't aware of. That I think firstly, if it's unpacked in a kind and compassionate way, so it's not, you're not trying to change anyone, it's more just a curiosity approach. And second, I think that complexity leadership skill of self-regulation would be very important here
yeah.
for someone to be able to keep themselves regulated, but also have the capacity for self-reflection. If we have those two things, I think there's possibly that opportunity for finding more common ground too, because we might be able to unpack those perspectives, observe maybe potential contradictions, or perhaps where there are similarities or overlaps with others, or at least have compassion and understanding for where other people are coming from. And that's something that we don't really have the opportunity to have those conversations often. So being able to create those spaces, as you mentioned, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think it's really important as well. I think it's really, and it's important for people who really want to understand this stuff and to be able to engage with it. I think it can also be really important for people who strongly disagree with it as well. Just step
Mm,
in the space, and even if you strongly disagree with somebody else's perspective on this, at least
mm,
understand someone's perspective before you disagree with it. And not to suggest we're all going to, agree on the same conclusion, or there's ever going to be a point in time where we all agree on the number of genders there are, or whatever, right? Not suggesting that we get to a point of agreement around this, but I think it is really important, um, even for the people who feel very strongly about these topics, to try to participate in some of these kind of events so that they can at least get some more exposure to why people have alternative views and why they're
Mm.
resistant and why other people are disagreeing and then why people might be reacting to their views in different ways, you know?
And I think, understanding others and ourselves. I'm curious your thoughts. I don't know if there's much research around it, but potentially around the role of fear in keeping people in certain worldviews. For example, if I get riled up or triggered or upset about a particular issue, and if I do that self-reflection, I realize, okay, something that's really important to me is social justice, and I feel like that view is impinging on that value,
Mm.
whereas others might sort of have more perspective of this is how things are, we don't need things to change, like change is scary. And so to what extent do you feel like fear might play a role in the values that we develop, or how strongly we hold on to them?
Yeah, look, I don't know if there's any scientific research on that at all, so I can't speak about the research, but intuitively it sounds plausible.
I don't know how one would study that. It would be quite challenging, but absolutely. No, thank you so much for walking through all of this. And there's so much to digest in it as well. So summarizing some of the layers that we've talked about today is looking at the culture wars and how this really shows up in society, both on big issues that may be quite controversial in society, such as around genders, as well as topics such as social cohesion and people having very different worldviews on big topics. And then to really unpack the culture wars, we can go one layer down into the worldviews and, okay, what is driving these culture wars? Okay, divergent worldviews. And then being able to look at, okay, what are our worldviews? Perhaps what are other worldviews? And then maybe exploring how we can at least have more constructive conversations using this language. And I guess that third layer is really looking into truth, which is what we'll go more into in the next episode. Is that an accurate summary of sort of the main points we sort of hit on today?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's great. How are you feeling about our conversation? So we haven't had a conversation about truth yet, but how are you feeling about that given today's conversation?
I'm excited. I feel like it's also quite I'm how to describe it. I'm curious, I'm excited. I feel like I have more language to discuss it and to see how it fits into your frameworks, and what it's linking to and how we can really bring it back to
Yeah.
uh, examples such as culture wars. So I'm really excited to discuss it because it's not just it's philosophical, but we've also built a way that we can look at, okay, how does that show up in society? How does that show up for ourselves? Conversations that we might see on the TV for politics down to conversations around the dinner table or the family barbecue. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm curious from our discussion today, again, we've covered a lot of ground. Is there something that you would like people to take away from this conversation that they might be able to apply in their own life or in their complexity leadership practices or exploration?
You always ask me these hard questions.
I always ask you for one. It's so
I know.
cruel.
Get it down to one. Let me try for two. I'll try my best. I think point number one is understanding the what and why of the culture wars is really critical to navigate these complex times that we're currently in. And I think point number two is cultivating some skills around working with diverse worldviews in your personal life, in your professional life, in the workplace. It is a really critical complexity leadership skill in my view.
Beautiful summary.
How was that?
Amazing.
My best.
Yeah. Fantastic. Look, I'm going to leave it there on that beautiful, clean note, and we will see you soon in our next episode around truth.
Can't wait. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Life, Leadership and Change with me, Cara Hawkins. I hope it's left you with plenty to think about and to feel inspired by. We have another exciting thing to share. At the end of this mini-series, we'll be doing a bonus episode dedicated entirely to your questions. So if today's conversation sparked something for you, or if there's anything across the series you'd love Aiden to dig into further, drop your questions in the comments section or in the form linked in the show notes. We'd love to hear what's on your mind. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit subscribe to receive more episodes like this. And remember to leave us a review to help others find the podcast. It makes a huge difference, and it's a great place to let me know what you thought, what you loved, and what you'd like to hear more of. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode.